Good morning, everyone. My name is Jonathan Levin. We're here to talk about trade policy. Here with me today, we have Shannon O'Neill, Senior Vice President and Director of Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of The Globalization Myth, Why Regions Matter. Also, Allison Schrager, my colleague at Bloomberg Opinion, covering economics. She's also a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and author of An Economist Walks into a Brothel and Other Unexpected Places to Understand Risk. Here's why we're here today, really. President Trump is going to hold an event in the White House Rose Garden tomorrow in which he will hit countries with so-called reciprocal tariffs, whatever that means. In theory, he says he's going to raise U.S. duties to a level that matches the tariff and non-tariff barriers that our exporters face in international markets. And it sounds deceivingly simple, but I can assure you it is not. Non-tariff barriers in general, extraordinarily hard to quantify. There's literature on this, but it really means different things to different people. Trump's deputies have talked about trying to account for things like food inspection standards. And then there are value-added taxes, which most economists don't even consider to have anything to do with trade policy at all. And so these details make a huge difference. In the most conservative interpretation of reciprocal tariff policy, we might be talking about maybe bumping up effective tariff rates by a couple of percentage points. In the most extreme cases, we could be talking about returning to the 19th century, a la William McKinley, a guy who has provided apparently great inspiration to President Trump. So, Shannon, why is Donald Trump doing this? Does he have a point in any of this when he says that, like, countries are ripping us off and this is something that we have to do?
Well, this administration seems to have lots of reasons why they want to do tariffs. So one of the reasons is this Trump's feeling, which has been there for many years, that deficits are bad, right? He thinks about it the way you balance your checkbook. And so when the United States imports more than it exports, that we're quote unquote getting a bad deal, that right, it should be more balanced, or even the United States should quote unquote be winning by sending more out into the world than they bring in. So that's one, is this idea of deficits. And we hear that a lot, particularly from President Trump himself. There are other issues too, and reasons why that have been put forward about why we're going to see some version of tariffs coming tomorrow. One is leverage. So we see a lot of, wanting to make a deal. So you put tariffs on that then you can peel off to get other things you want, whether it's economic issues like other people lowering their tariffs, or it's security issues. You want Mexico or Canada or China to reduce the flows of fentanyl in, or sort of the other dangers that come in across the US borders. That's another reason. And then finally, you've heard from this administration that they also want to raise revenues. So they see tariffs, back to your, McKinley in the 19th century, they want to have money come into the United States, right? And so particularly Peter Navarro's out there talking about big numbers that these tariffs that they're planning on putting in place would bring to the US Treasury, which would then also offset the tax cuts that they're thinking about this year as well.
Right. So revenue addressing sort of these bilateral trade deficits that seem kind of bad on the surface, maybe negotiating a leverage. Can you accomplish all three of those things at the same time with the same blunt tool? Does that seem like a good idea?
You can't actually, right? Because if you do replace, US imports with manufacturing at home, then the amount of money you're going to collect, it goes down. Right? If you really want to collect money, then you actually don't want to bring manufacturing back to the United States, because you want those imports, which is where you get the money. So there are different, aspects here. The other side of a lot of this is, what does this mean for the US economy? What does it mean for the global economy? So if you put big tariffs on, you will reduce demand as prices go up. You may reduce manufacturing at home and abroad as people buy fewer things because things are more expensive. And then if you go into a recession, or lots of countries go into recession, you're going to collect fewer taxes because there's just less money floating around and purchasing happening. So there's a lot of back and forth here. And, needless to say, a lot of uncertainty actually what these tariffs will look like. The amounts, how fast they'll be put on, how broadly they'll be, the sort of scope and breadth of these tariffs, and how likely they are to stick.
Yeah. Allison, so Shannon underscores the sort of scope of possibilities here, the risks as we go into tomorrow. You're always my go-to expert on risk. Let me ask you a question. Like, strategically, does it make sense to make such a crazy show of this? Like here we are. We're several months into the administration, and Trump has been sort of dragging this out. There's been a big crescendo to this announcement, but like 24 hours before it happens, it could mean so many different things, right? Like I was saying, it could end up being kind of a nothing burger in the sense that like maybe effective tariff rates go up a couple of percentage points, but it doesn't change the world. Or we could see levels of tariffs such that we really haven't seen in a century. And it would, in some ways, I mean, the US economy is a lot more than just trade, but in some ways it would fundamentally change the way the US and the global economy works. Like, what is the advantage of creating so much uncertainty around this announcement for tomorrow?
Well, I mean, uncertainty tends to be bad for markets, but so from an economic and financial perspective, I'm not quite sure, but giving him the benefit of the doubt, which, we should all try to do. Maybe there's like a deal-making thing going on here. And maybe in the end, we're going to end up with lower tariffs. And this is a way to bully countries into lowering their tariffs. And I mean, that would be good. So, I mean, the problem with that is, one, we don't know if it works. And second of all, I mean, this doesn't work as a repeated game. Like, you can say, I'm going to put this big tariff on you unless you back down, but you can't keep doing that unless you actually put on big tariffs. Right. So maybe he's just doing this finally all in one go to get everyone to be like, come to the table, like, all right, we're going to lower our tariffs. Although I don't know if Europe's going to lower their VAT, but like their actual tariffs, or maybe some of their regulations that make terms of trade harder. And he, rather than, doing this piecemeal, that he's just sort of creating a lot of chaos. So like, I doubt this is what I kept telling myself, because I wanted to believe that, ultimately all presidents want the economy to succeed and have some degree of, economic literacy. But I'm starting to worry that he actually just wants tariffs. So I guess we'll find out tomorrow. If, as I said, you pointed us to a Washington Post article that one possibility is we might just have this broad 20% tariff on almost all of our imports. That's less reciprocal sounding to me. But if he really is like, all right, I'm going to put a tariff, whatever tariff you have on us, however that's defined, we're going to have that back on you, then maybe everyone's going to come to the table and we're just going to end up in a better trading world tomorrow where there's just lower tariffs and regulations all around. I mean, it's unlikely, but like, I'm hoping for that.
Right, exactly. And to your point, there have been a couple of articles out in the past, say 36 hours, one from the Wall Street Journal, one from the Washington Post, that I think have gotten markets attention. And they sort of suggested broad strokes that there are people in the administration, lots of moving parts still at this late hour, but there are people in the administration that are looking to something like a reversion to the old universal tariff idea that Trump talked about during the campaign, right? That we could have a single universal tariff basically on everyone and everything, and that universal tariff could be as much as 20%. I think in general markets do not like this idea because they think that the ultimate number, the effective tariff rate, ends up being higher under that proposal. But I will say there is one thing that might be kind of good about that idea, and it is just simplicity, right? Like, one thing that I think really worries me about the practicality, the implementation of this wild reciprocal tariff thing is, first you need to figure out like what is actually going to be the calculation, and all your counterparties are certainly not going to agree with whatever calculation you come up with. But then there's also the implementation, right? The harmonized tariff schedule of the United States talks about, more than 10,000 individual items, and we trade with like 200 countries. So are we going to have like 2 million tariffs? How on earth is that going to work? And I think that this is an administration that worries about bureaucracy, right? So Is complexity generally a good thing in economics, Allison?
Aren't we going to have that external IRS?
Oh, the external revenues. Yeah, they'll work it out. They'll work it
So
out.
we're getting rid of the IRS and we're just going to have an external one. Yeah, it's, as I said, I mean, this is a big issue in the EU even, which is supposed to be a free trade zone, but there's all these sort of like confusing backdoor tariffs even within the EU, which is one of the reasons, one of many reasons why, they struggle and have so much fragmentation. So another advantage, I guess, to a simpler tariff, especially given that it's through executive order and not through Congress, is it will probably be reversed in the next administration, unless it's JD Vance or another Trump term, maybe. I guess that's one advantage too, is it will be relatively easy for the next, I guess, president to get rid of.
Right. Shannon, does Donald Trump, in your view, have a coherent worldview about trade? Like when you see all of these policies, do they add up to something? Like we may disagree here with the objectives, but do you feel that you understand what Donald Trump is trying to accomplish here?
I think it's a little bit clearer this term than it was the last term. And if you read some of the things that he used to talk about in the 80s and the early 90s, he does have somewhat of a coherent view. And I would say, his theory of the global economy is sort of a real estate-based theory. It kind of goes back to a mercantilist view of the world, that there's a fixed amount of goods or a fixed amount of wealth that's out there. That's kind of a real estate view, right? There's a fixed amount of land that's out there, and that the United States should try to get as much of it as they can. And you use your power and your leverage, and here would be tariffs and other things, to get that, to get those goods, right? To get that part of the economic wealth of that pie that's a pretty fixed pie out there. And so I do think, and so that's why deficits are inherently for him negative, right? That means you're losing that trade. I think that also explains a little bit some of the, people during the campaign thought he would be more isolationist, right? He would pull back from, Ukraine, he would pull back from other parts of the world. But we've seen him pretty interventionist, right? He's talking about Greenland, he's talking about Canada, he's talking about the Panama Canal. That also fits in this mercantilist view of the world, that there's spheres of influence, that you want to, collect as much wealth as possible. So I think there's a somewhat coherent view of the world. And what's different than the first time, or his first term, is those around him, more of them than not, share this view of the world, are willing to go along with whatever view of the world that he wants to put forward. And I think that was not particularly the case in the first term. You had a lot of more mainstream economic thinkers and the like. And this time people are pretty much on board with this. They know what they signed up for, and here we are.
Yeah. I'll float my own theory on this here, and I hope you two will take me to task here if you disagree. But I see a lot of commentary, including from our colleagues, that the Trump trade policy is totally scattershot. And having read Bob Lighthizer book, No Trade is Free, it's hard for me to see it as completely scattershot, because it feels like what we've been doing here these first few months of Trump 2.0 is really sort of the checklist right from Bob Lighthizer's book. This term, reciprocal tariffs, even is a term that Bob Lighthizer throws around a lot. And so I think there is a worldview there. I think where Trump kind of really goes off the tracks, and I'd be interested to get your response here, is just around prioritization. If you look at somebody like a Lighthizer, who I think is clearly a protectionist, but a protectionist with a worldview, he has a very clear sense of what's the most important. And I think for a guy like Lighthizer, that's China above everything else. And with China, it's more than just trade. It's these big geopolitical questions, these big national security questions. And I don't see that level of prioritization in this administration's approach. It seems like we've gone at least as hard against our neighbors in Canada and Mexico as we have against China. And I also think, you know, there's this sense that like, well, maybe we'd be willing to trade, you know, some concessions to China for like TikTok. And if you believe that like China is an existential national security threat, like, would you make concessions for TikTok? It doesn't add up to me. What do you think, Allison? Do you think that this administration has a clear sense of priorities when it comes to these things?
I mean, maybe it's the sort of negotiation strategy of I'm shooting my friend to scare my enemy. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and
The madman
ultimately,
theory, sort of, or
I don't know if that works,
yeah.
but maybe he's just showing he's tough. I mean, also, I mean, Shannon would know this better than I do, that China also has a bigger trade presence with a lot of our trading partners now. So even if we just said, all right, we're targeting China, but we have good trade relationships with Mexico, we still have some exposure to China. So maybe it's also trying to flush out China amongst our trading partners. Again, Shannon knows more about the Mexican economy and its relationships to China than I do, but maybe there's something there too.
Yeah, I might just add, you know, I think there's a lot of similarities between Bob Lighthizer and Donald Trump, and that's why they were together the first term. It's interesting that Lighthizer isn't back in this term. Though some of the people that, you know, were his allies and colleagues are in part of this administration. But I would say I think there is a bit of a difference, as I read it, between Lighthizer's view and Trump in particular's view on China. And, you know, Lighthizer saw it as a national security concern, as an economic, you know, perhaps almost existential threat to the United States if it's not taken on. I think there are people in this administration, whether it's, you know, Marco Rubio or Waltz or others, who also share a very hawkish view on China. But I'm not sure that's exactly where Donald Trump lands, right? I think he's also the deal maker, right? He was very proud of the first deal he made with China. I think second time around might be a bit more difficult. The first one didn't go down exactly or follow through exactly as he had hoped. But I think there's a little bit of daylight between that view of China and how much of a threat it is vis-a-vis others, and particularly, and, you know, as I look at the, you know, the press conferences of Donald Trump and others, he's really focused on deficits. And over the last, you know, 4-8 years, we've seen the deficit with the United States come down with China, in part because China has weaned itself off of the United States, or is, you know, de-risked or de-linked from the United States. And, you know, today China trades more with Southeast Asia than it does with the United States. It, you know, it trades more with Russia than it does with Germany. It has really changed its geographic trading footprint in ways that make it, you know, there are tariffs already in place. We may see more tariffs on China come tomorrow, but it's less of a hit to the economy than it was back in 2018 when Trump first came in. So I think there's a bit of some distance there. And then the other issue is, you know, we've been talking about sort of the implementation and what we've seen put in place so far. And, you know, the biggest trading partners of the United States are friends, not enemies. And so you go and you put tariffs on steel and aluminum, you know, China doesn't send steel and aluminum to the United States. It's really Canada, Mexico, Brazil, South Korea, some European countries. So if you're going to use this tool of tariffs, you're really going to hit friends more than you're going to hit, you know, rivals.
Sure. Do you know why he's so focused on the current account deficit, but say, although it is related to just the budget deficit? I mean, is that just because he has an idea that goods are fixed? But I mean, I don't think of Trump as being averse to debt generally, but I mean, it's weird that he's so obsessed with the current account deficit. I mean, maybe we should just start talking about the capital account surplus and you'd feel happier.
I mean, that might be one way to go. I mean, the other interesting thing I find too in all of this talk is we're really talking about manufactured goods, right? That's where he focuses in, sort of old school industries, you know, maybe, you know, worldview of the economy shaped back in the 1980s or early 90s. But if you look at what the United States trades around the world, we trade services, right? We trade commodities. We trade about $700 million or $1 billion of, you know, agricultural goods and, you know, things that we mine or energy and the like. But we trade well over $1 trillion worth of high-end services, right? This is all the Netflix and the Amazons and the cloud and other kinds of things, education and the like. And that is not really factored into the way they're talking about this. Though I think it could be factored into the retaliatory tariffs we may see from countries, right? If I was another country and I wanted to retaliate, you know, I wouldn't focus on cars, even though the United States is going to focus on cars. I'd focus on banks, or I'd focus on other kinds of high-end services, where really the United States is growing and gaining market share all around the world.
Can they? I mean, I feel like we have such a big footprint in financial services, and also, the dollar is and treasuries are so critical to the global financial system, and that's not changing anytime soon. So I mean, could they really get rid of?
I mean, you're already seeing Europe talk about banking equivalency and those sorts of things. So that would hit, the JP Morgans and the others of the world. You're seeing them look at digital taxes. That hits lots of the, the high-end services. One could imagine you see lots of data privacy issues and others going up in free trade agreements like the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that brings together over a dozen Asian countries and the like. And the way they're defining data and the like could be detrimental to, to the Amazons, to the Metas, to the others, right? Sort of preferences for the kinds of companies that are within those trading blocks rather than the companies that come from outside, which would be US.
Is that because of Trump, or is that just because they have a hang up about data privacy?
I mean, it's both, right? But I'm just saying, if we want to retaliate, which we will see, right? Tomorrow we're going to get some amount of tariffs, and there'll be some countries that choose to retaliate. There'll be some countries that choose not to. But if you're going to retaliate, right, last time around, we saw them go after, Kentucky, bourbon and Harley Davidson motorcycles, and maybe those will be on the docket again. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of these countries decide to go after high-end services, because that's really one where the United States exports have grown. And two, the heads of those companies were all sitting up at the inaugural address and have an ear into Trump, more than, say, Harley Davidson.
That is a more sophisticated argument for what they're doing is, as the world becomes as we become trade more about high-end services, and as we move more towards data, and Europe and certainly some parts of Asia do have a big hang up about privacy. I mean, maybe he sees that, and we're negotiating. Maybe he's trying to sort of relax those standards, because I mean, that could be sort of a hamper on trade going forward. Maybe we're going to work that out. Maybe. I mean, I doubt it, but it's a possibility. It's like maybe there's a very sophisticated argument happening, and he's just talking about cars and steel to distract us from the bigger issue, which is going to be AI and data.
Yeah, right. Well,
it's a chess game, not checkers, is what you're saying.
Three-dimensional.
Well, you never know.
Let me ask you both, though, about productive ways forward here. Allison, you brought up this idea of the twin deficits, right, which often gets overlooked in the discourse about this, but I think is very important in economics. There is this sort of understanding that there's at least a relationship. Maybe the causality isn't always clear, but there's a relationship between fiscal deficits and current account deficits. And that seems pretty important to me here, as you rightfully point out. And it strikes me that there are things that we could be doing differently domestically in terms of tax policy, for instance, to address this trade issue ourselves if we really wanted to, rather than sort of scapegoating the rest of the world and saying these trade deficits are something that everybody else just imposed on us, and we had no free will, no role to play whatsoever in any of this. I had a column, I think late last week, about the merits of a value-added tax, and progressives generally don't like the idea because it's seen as regressive, but a value-added tax would start to address some of these incentives to consume too much and save too little, like the real underlying things behind our trade deficit. Is that a rationale to go with an approach like that, do you think, Allison?
Yeah, I love this column because I love VATs. Like most tax economists, they're my favorite tax. They're the most efficient of all taxes. So, I mean, there's part of me that's like, well, I would really like a VAT and a lower income tax, just as a matter of tax policy. So, I mean, yeah, maybe this is our way of we're going to end up with a VAT. We're going to end up with a consumption tax just because we're going to end up paying higher taxes. So, I mean, maybe this is his way of getting that in. Or I think certainly when they do tax reform, they're probably going to do at least the border adjustment tax, which was supposed to go in with reform in 2017, which
Right,
isn't
on the
really a
poll,
VAT, but it kind of has some flavor. And you could even, if you squint hard enough, call it a tariff, although it's not really one either.
Well, it was meant, to sort of be, it was meant to sort of address the trade differences piece of VATs without doing a lot of the other VAT stuff that Republicans didn't really like. But
Yeah,
go
I mean,
on.
as you point out, VAT is not a tariff because it's neutral on, traded and
Exactly.
non-traded goods. But, it is, I said, we do need revenue. And I said, consumption taxes are, as we say in public finance, less distortionary than other taxes. They can be regressive, but, it depends on how you implement them. But I think even if we did do that, even if we did take a hard look and we're a lot more fiscally responsible, we're still probably going to have a current account deficit, capital account surplus, just because people want to send their money here. I mean, not only because we're, the global reserve currency and all these other things, but we also have the best, despite our best efforts, the best, most innovative companies. Like Europe's not going to grow. I mean, they're going to try, maybe they're going to do a little bit better, but they're not going to have like Amazon. Like they just don't have the spirit or, infrastructure or, institutions for that. Like people are just going to want to invest their money here. They're going to want to go to college here, we hope. And all of these things are going to be sort of essentially why we're always just going to have this deficit, or, we could say capital account surplus if people, that makes them feel better. So, and that's just a sign of the fact we have the best economy in the world.
Sure. Shannon, I'm not going to force you to co-sign on my VAT now proposal, but are there any sort of, supposing we did think that our current account deficits were a little bit too deep, a little bit too wide, are there any productive ways, as in the opposite of tariffs, which are generally deleterious for everybody, are there any productive ways that we could go about closing the current account deficit in your view?
When I look at some of the policies, right, the policies we're seeing come out of this administration are tariffs. So, there's a punitive side. We're also seeing a real restriction on, at least so far, on migration. It's been focused on the people who are here and sending many of them out. But we will see, but we've started to see some movement on limiting those that are coming into the United States. So I'd say both of those are, neither are helpful. Like back to like Allison's point of like, despite our best efforts, this is still the best economy in the world and people want to come here. Those are not helping us be the best economy. And I'd add to that we are cutting government spending for all kinds of research and development and the like. And so you're starting to put in these long-term barriers to the growth of the overall economy, I would say, right? We're not investing as much in research and development, especially at a public level, which, has sort of basic research that is less fundable often by private companies because you don't see the return very quickly. You're not potentially bringing in sort of the best and brightest, the high skilled people who are going to come here and do PhDs, whether it does cuts everybody out, but it cuts some out. And, you're seeing anecdotal evidence of sort of high level scientists and others, taking that job in Canada or going back to China or going to other places because they're worried about sort of staying here in the United States. And by putting in tariffs, yes, we may see some foreign direct investment. So that's helpful, right? There's money coming in to the United States for that. But you're not going to see the United States as linked into global supply chains. People will come and bring money here to build a plant or put production here for the US market. But it's much less likely if we have tariffs coming in and then you have tariffs on markets going out, that the US factories will hook into global supply chains, right? Will be the providers of capital goods or the providers of inputs and intermediate goods into production elsewhere because there'll be retaliatory tariffs potentially, right? So as I look at just the way these elements are going to affect the overall economy, in the end, the United States is just not a big trader, right? It's only 25% of GDP that's trade. That's much less than, say, European countries, Canada, Mexico, Japan, others. But it still is one of the more innovative parts, right? The part that exports out or the part that brings in imports. And so as I look at the overall kind of growth of the United States, this is going to be a damper. We still have a lot of those benefits of entrepreneurship and financing and talent and the like here, and the innovative sort of spirit and the creative destruction and all that kind of stuff that allows companies to rise and fall in the US. But this will not help that, right? It's going to hinder some of that dynamism that we've seen, and that really has been why the United States has been one of the fastest growing economies, whether advanced industrial or even emerging market over the last few years.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, we're running up against the 30-minute mark, and that is a great place to leave this conversation. So thank you so much, Shannon O'Neill. Thank you so much, Allison Schrager. And thank you to everyone for tuning in. Tomorrow is reciprocal tariff day, so we will see what that brings. And check back in here at Bloomberg Opinion for more analysis. Take care.